Towards the end of 2025, I was able to get my hands on some e-waste grade PCs. And by that I mean 2 incomplete units, 2 cases, 1 PSU, 2 motherboards, CPUs and coolers. I then bought another CPU, the i5-6400, and it is this 4-core 4-threads beast that we'll be reviewing in this video. While running the benchmarks, I remember that back in the day when workstations using Skylake became available, our IT guy was not that impressed by them. While DDR4 support was there, the RAM available initially was still in the low 2 GHz speeds. But the Z170 motherboard that I got allows using XMP profiles even on this lower frequency non-hyper-threaded Office Lake CPU. And unlike the RAM available back then, the mismatched sticks that I decided to use will go to 3000 MHz. So, is the i5-6400 the ultimate office CPU, or can it game? Ultimately, the answer will be up to the gaming results, and to make sure that the CPU can stretch its legs, I used a GTX 980 and resorted to ridiculous low resolutions and graphical settings. As for memory speed, using just XMP, I ended up settling for 2933 MHz, and then I set 1T for the command rate. And, to top things off, I used the tried and true GigASUS rendering task to gauge the IPC improvements. More about the methodology and results after the gaming section. And speaking of gaming results, testing was done at the lowest resolution, rendering scale and quality settings to avoid a GPU bottleneck. In case of Marvel Rivals, for example, the test was done at 720 resolution, 30% render scale and low settings. The average FPS of 84 looks good on its own, but the 1% loss of 31 does not. This is an online competitive title, so this won't cut it. And I won't even mention the 0.1% loss. But I guess this is to be expected from a CPU that is slower than the minimum required i5-6600K. Cyberpunk 2077 is, however, a single-player title, so, at least in my opinion, 30 FPS 41% lows should be fine. And at 1024 by 768 resolution, performance FSR and low settings, the system managed 86 FPS on average and 53 FPS 41% lows. This is perfectly playable in my books. I tested Arc Raiders again, at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings. I tested in the DAM map and the i5-6400 managed an average of 49 FPS and 1% lows of 20. This is worse by 3 FPS compared to the results that I gathered back in January. Regardless, the game doesn't feel right, at least not until you set a 30 FPS cap. I did not like the results I got for Fortnite, so I ran the replay again. Still, at 720 resolution and performance mode, the system got averages somewhere above 140 FPS and 1% lows in the low 40s. As sad as it sounds, you might need to set up a framerate cap to smooth out the frame delivery. And speaking of 100 FPS delta between average and 1% lows, here we have control. I did my run from ventilation to reactor control at 960 by 540 and lower settings. The processor managed 179 FPS for the average and 79 FPS for the 1% lows. The difference is quite big, but fortunately, this time around those 1% lows are much better. Rainbow Six Siege ran much smoother, thankfully. I used the CAN benchmark, 720 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings. The i5-6400 then got an average of 184 FPS and 1% lows of 126. The 0.1% lows were also good at almost 100 FPS, so this one will run fine. Doom Eternal ran just as well. I used the first indoors fight as a benchmark at 720 resolution and low settings. The average FPS was 172, and the 1% lows remained above 100 FPS. The 0.1% FPS were also good at 97 FPS. The Office Lake CPU had no problems running Apex Legends. At 720 resolution and low settings, the i5-6400 managed 194 FPS for the average and 128 FPS for the 1% lows. The 0.1% lows are also good, in the high 80s, so you should have no problems using this CPU to play this game. For Far Cry 6, the performance standard that I hold the i5-6400 to is more relaxed, of just 30 FPS for the 1% lows. During the CAN benchmark running at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings, the CPU did better than that. It managed 85 FPS for the average and 51 FPS for the 1% lows. Overwatch 2 has the well-deserved reputation of running well on low-end hardware, so testing the CPU at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings runs the risk of hitting the internal 600 FPS framerate cap. The i5-6400 narrowly avoids that, with a maximum FPS recorded at 590. The average FPS was 485 and, more importantly, the 1% lost at just 255, a bit lower than the 70% of the average than I expected. Don't get me wrong, the gameplay is fine, but I did see better from other CPUs. In Resident Evil 4, the Skylake CPU does manage to provide more than 30 FPS for the 1% lows, so the CPU gets a passing grade. I tested the game at 720 resolution, prioritized performance preset and FSR set to performance. Both average FPS of 131 and 1% lows of 81 are perfectly fine. The 0.1% lows drops however to 20, so some stuttering is to be expected. The performance in Counter-Strike 2 is somewhat odd. Not bad, but odd. The CPU was tested in DA dust at 720 resolution and low settings. The average FPS is quite good at almost 200 FPS, but the 1% lows is just 97 FPS, so the more competitive players will feel the occasional changes in frame pacing. Borderlands 3 is another single-player title, so I asked for the CPU only 30 FPS for the 1% lows during the canned benchmark. The test was performed at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and very low settings, and the CPU averaged 103 FPS and got 69 FPS for the 1% lows. As I keep saying in most of my recent videos, DOTA 2 ends up CPU bottlenecked quite easily. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the Skylake CPU averaged 88 FPS and the 1% low stayed in the low 50s. As I was watching the numbers showing up on the screen overlay, they reminded me of how a Haswell i7 performed. The Finals is another game that gave me the same feeling of deja vu that I mentioned earlier. I ran my test at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings, and I got in return 114 FPS for the average and 53 FPS for the 1% lows. This last metric is lower than the 60 FPS that I usually demand, and quite far for the 70% of the average FPS. This can be felt in the game experience, fine most of the time, but with the occasional choppiness. The CPU got a similar average FPS to 1% lows ratio in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I ran the built-in benchmark at the lowest settings and 800 by 600 resolution. The CPU averaged close to 100 FPS, but then got the 1% lows at just 43. Fine for a single-player game, but some players might feel a frame drop once in a while. And we'll close on the same note with Terminator. Just like the previous game, anything more than 30 FPS for the 1% lows is a bonus. So a bit over 200 FPS for the average is more than fine. The 1% lows will drop to less than half, but still at a more than enough 97 FPS. Like I do with all CPUs, I then timed how much it takes to perform a video compression task on the CPU. It's always the same video, with the same settings, so the amount of work is the same for all CPUs. By multiplying the time needed to complete the task with the average frequency, you get the number of clock cycles needed to complete the task, and this number is now frequency independent. CPUs with higher IPC will require fewer clock cycles, so lower is better. In the case of the i5-6400, the compression took a bit over half of an hour. This then translates to a bit less than 22,700 billion clock cycles. This is worse than what I expected, and you can see that in this chart where I have a few other CPUs for comparison. It does not look pretty. If anything, it is yet another thing to point at when talking about Intel's stagnation from back then. With all testing done, I have to admit, our IT guy was right. I for one did not expect that the GigASUS test would have the i6-6400 perform as poorly as it did. It's like the 6400 is not part of the same 6th gen architecture. As for the DDR4 support, with the current prices for RAM, this starts to feel more of a curse than a blessing. Granted, the DDR3 prices crept up as well, but not as much as DDR4. So, should you get the i5-6400? Depends on the price really. And here's something funny. I've seen the CPU down to even 8 USD. This is close to i5-2400 territory of pricing, and as disappointed I was with the Office Lake i5, it still performs better than the Sandy Bridge corresponding CPU. So, judging based on the price of the processor alone, then yes, the 6400 is probably the best chip from the under 10 USD price bin. The thing is, a CPU needs a motherboard, and LGA 1151V1 boards are a bit more expensive. This then gets compounded by the increased DDR4 prices, making the entire platform less appealing, especially when compared to equivalent 4th gen. Funny seeing the same discussions that happened when AM5 hit the market to get rehashed now, but for older Intel platforms and older DDR standards. Anyway, I for one am more willing to consider a 4th gen platform before recommending the 6th gen. But who knows, maybe the CPU we'll be reviewing in one of the following videos might change my mind. As for this one, well, we're done. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for the next one.